There's a lot of talk about discrimination based on what people do, their habits, and how they look. Two of these categories of people are smokers and those that are overweight. A lot of smokers complain that they're discriminated against unjustly. And there are groups of people who are overweight who say we should not be discriminated against just because we happen to be heavier than the average American. Well, in our recent poll, we asked Americans their image of people who smoke and their image of people who are overweight to see what we could find out empirically. Here's the data. Indeed, 40% of Americans, 4 out of 10, say they look negatively at a person because he or she smokes. So that does suggest, although it's not in majority territory, clearly a significant group of Americans do look down on Americans simply because they have that one habit, they smoke. What about being significantly overweight, as we phrased it in the survey? Well, 29% of Americans say, in fact, they look more negatively at a person because he or she is significantly overweight. Now, that's not as high as smoking, and it's not on an absolute basis huge. It's clearly not a majority of Americans, but it suggests that a little under a third of Americans do look at a person who is overweight and say, I have a more negative opinion of that person. What about smokers themselves? Here's an interesting question. Do they think that they themselves look negatively at smokers? Well, no, there's basically denial here. Only 7% of smokers tell us that they look more negatively at smokers generally compared to 40% of all Americans. Not quite the same discrepancy when it comes to people who themselves are overweight. 25% of people who themselves tell us they're overweight say they look more negatively at people who are overweight, in other words, themselves. By the way, in our latest survey, about 20% of Americans still tell us they smoke, and 42% of Americans admit to us in the survey that they would define themselves as overweight. I'm Dr. Frank Newport, Editor-in-Chief of the Gallup poll.